The chess pieces are moving again, and this time the stakes couldn't be higher. Washington just deployed a second aircraft carrier strike group toward Iranian waters, a $13 billion floating fortress bristling with F-A-18 Super Hornets, guided missile destroyers, and enough firepower to flatten a small nation. On paper, this looks like standard power projection, the kind of muscle flexing we've seen 100 times before. But here's what they're not telling you. Iran didn't blink. Instead of backing down, Tehran activated something far more dangerous than anyone in the Pentagon anticipated: a coordinated response involving Russia's hypersonic missile technology, China's naval presence in the region, and a unified front among BRICS nations that's rewriting the rules of global conflict. What happened next shattered every assumption about American naval supremacy and exposed the fatal flaw in Washington's outdated playbook. The carrier battle groups that once made adversaries tremble are now floating targets in an age of precision missiles traveling at Mach 9. The Empire's favorite weapon just became its greatest liability, and the implications reach far beyond the Persian Gulf into the very foundation of dollar hegemony itself. Let me be absolutely clear about what we're witnessing here, because the mainstream narrative is doing everything in its power to obscure the reality of this situation. When the Pentagon announced the deployment of that second carrier strike group, the USS Dwight D. Eisenhower joining the USS Gerald R. Ford in the region, every major news outlet framed it as a show of strength, a clear message to Tehran that America means business. But if you've been paying attention to the actual dynamics of modern warfare, to the technological leaps that have occurred over the past decade, to the fundamental shifts in how power is projected and contested in the 21st century, you'd understand that what we're really looking at is something closer to a desperate bluff than a position of strength. Think about it for a moment. The United States has spent the better part of 70 years building its entire military doctrine around carrier battle groups. These floating cities represent the pinnacle of American naval engineering, costing upwards of $13 billion each, not counting the additional billions for the destroyers, cruisers, submarines, and support vessels that travel with them. The Carrier Strike Group has been the ultimate expression of American power projection since World War II, the ace card that Washington could play anywhere in the world to bring a regional power to its knees. But here's the uncomfortable truth that nobody in the defense establishment wants to acknowledge: that entire paradigm is now obsolete, rendered strategically irrelevant by technologies that didn't even exist when most of these vessels were designed. Iran knows this, Russia knows this, China absolutely knows this. And increasingly, the rest of the world is beginning to understand it too. We're talking about hypersonic missiles that can travel at speeds exceeding Mach 9, that can maneuver in flight, that are effectively impossible to intercept with current defense systems. The Russians have the Kinzhal and the Zircon. The Chinese have the DF-21D and the DF-26, specifically designed as carrier killers. And yes, Iran has been receiving technological transfers from both Moscow and Beijing that have fundamentally altered the calculus of any potential conflict in the Persian Gulf. When that second carrier arrived in the region, something extraordinary happened that you probably didn't hear about in the mainstream press. Iran didn't scramble its jets. It didn't mobilize ground forces. It didn't even issue the typical fiery rhetoric we've come to expect. Instead, Tehran did something far more sophisticated and infinitely more dangerous from Washington's perspective. It conducted a coordinated military exercise with Russian and Chinese forces in the very waters where those American carriers were operating. This wasn't announced with fanfare. There were no press conferences, but military satellites tracked the movements, and intelligence analysts around the world understood exactly what message was being sent. The exercise involved the deployment of Russian hypersonic missile systems to strategic positions along the Caspian Sea, Chinese-type Osei I-5 destroyers moving through the Indian Ocean in what Beijing called routine naval operations, and Iranian fast attack craft equipped with advanced anti-ship missiles conducting coordinated maneuvers in the Strait of Hormuz. The message was unmistakable. Any military action against Iran would not be a contained regional conflict, but rather the opening salvo of a much wider confrontation involving nuclear-armed powers with technological capabilities that could neutralize America's traditional advantages. Now, let's talk about what this really means for American strategic positioning in the Middle East and beyond. For decades, the United States has maintained its hegemonic status through a combination of dollar dominance and military supremacy. These two pillars have been mutually reinforcing. The dollar's role as the global reserve currency has been guaranteed by American military might, and that military might has been funded by the exorbitant privilege of printing the world's reserve currency. It's a beautiful system if you're the one running it, but it requires one absolutely essential component: the credible threat of overwhelming force. The carrier battle group has been the physical manifestation of that threat. When Washington wanted to pressure a country, to enforce sanctions, to protect oil shipments, or to overthrow a government that stepped out of line, the carrier strike group was the tool of choice. Its very presence in a region was supposed to communicate unquestionable dominance. But what happens when that dominance is called into question? What happens when potential adversaries possess weapon systems that can turn a $13 billion carrier into a $13 billion artificial reef in a matter of minutes? This is where the situation becomes truly fascinating from a geopolitical standpoint. The deployment of those carriers to the Iranian theater isn't just a military calculation. It's a desperate attempt to maintain the illusion of invincibility that has been central to American power for generations. Washington cannot afford to back down, because backing down would reveal what many international observers already suspect, that the emperor has no clothes, that American military dominance in an era of hypersonic missiles and integrated air defense systems is far more limited than the Pentagon would like us to believe. But Iran, Russia, and China have also made their own calculation, and it's a brilliant one when you think about it strategically. They're not seeking to directly confront American forces and trigger a catastrophic war that nobody wants. Instead, they're systematically demonstrating that the old tools of American coercion no longer work the way they used to. Every time Washington deploys a carrier and fails to achieve its political objectives, every time an adversary refuses to blink in the face of American military posturing, the mystique erodes a little further. It's death by 1,000 cuts to American credibility. Consider what happened in the weeks following that second carrier deployment. You would expect Iran to moderate its behavior, to scale back its regional activities, to perhaps come to the negotiating table with a more conciliatory posture. Instead, we saw the exact opposite. Iranian-backed forces in Yemen continued their operations in the Red Sea, disrupting global shipping lanes that account for roughly 15% of global maritime trade. Iranian advisors in Syria maintained their positions despite American demands for withdrawal. Iranian influence in Iraq, if anything, seemed to strengthen rather than diminish. The carriers were there, the firepower was there, but the intended effect was completely absent. And here's where it gets even more interesting. While this naval standoff was playing out in the Middle East, something else was happening in the global financial architecture that most people completely missed. The BRICS nations announced an expansion of their alternative payment systems explicitly designed to bypass dollar-denominated transactions. Saudi Arabia, America's longtime ally in the region, was in advanced talks about accepting yuan for oil sales. The United Arab Emirates was increasing its gold reserves at a record pace. These might seem like separate issues, but they're intimately connected to what's happening in those waters off the Iranian coast. You see, the whole point of maintaining military dominance in the Middle East has been to ensure that global energy markets remain denominated in dollars, that the oil flows continue under terms favorable to Washington and its allies, and that no regional power can challenge this arrangement. But if American military power can be effectively neutralized by adversaries with advanced missile technology, if carrier battle groups can be placed at risk without even engaging in direct combat, then the entire foundation of dollar hegemony in the energy sector begins to crumble. The Iranians understand this dynamic better than almost anyone. They've been living under comprehensive American sanctions for decades. They've been cut off from the SWIFT payment system, they've had their assets frozen, their oil exports throttled, their economy subjected to what amounts to economic warfare. And yet they've survived, more than survived actually. They've built indigenous military capabilities, developed alternative trading relationships, and created economic resilience that has confounded Western analysts who predicted regime collapse year after year. This resilience isn't just about Iranian determination or resourcefulness, though those factors certainly play a role. It's about a fundamental shift in global power dynamics that the deployment of a second carrier group cannot reverse. When the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991, the United States enjoyed what appeared to be a unipolar moment. American power seemed unchallengeable. The Washington Consensus dominated economic thinking. NATO expanded eastward without serious opposition. Military interventions in the Middle East met resistance, but nothing that threatened core American interests. But that moment has passed, and what we're seeing now is the painful adjustment to a multipolar reality that Washington has been reluctant to accept. The rise of China as an economic superpower, the resurgence of Russia as a military power willing to challenge American primacy, the emergence of regional powers like Iran that cannot be easily coerced or contained. These are not temporary aberrations, but structural changes in the international system. The carrier deployment, then, is less about Iran specifically, and more about attempting to hold together a crumbling architecture of global dominance. It's a signal to allies in the region, Israel, Saudi Arabia, the Gulf states, that America is still committed, still powerful, still capable of protecting their interests, but those allies are increasingly hedging their bets, pursuing their own accommodations with rising powers, and questioning whether American security guarantees are as reliable as they once were. Look at what Saudi Arabia has been doing. Despite decades of close military and economic ties with Washington, Riyadh has been systematically diversifying its international relationships. The Saudis brokered a détente with Iran, mediated by China of all countries, something that would have been unthinkable just a few years ago. They've been exploring membership in BRICS, they've been conducting military exercises with Russia, they've been investing heavily in Chinese infrastructure projects. This isn't the behavior of a country that sees American power as permanent or unquestionable, and the Iranians, for their part, have been masterful in exploiting these shifting dynamics. Rather than confronting American power directly, they've built what amounts to an asymmetric deterrence architecture. It's not just about missiles, though those are certainly important. It's about regional influence networks, proxy forces, economic relationships with countries that are willing to bypass sanctions, and technological partnerships that allow them to level the playing field against the adversary with a military budget that dwarfs their own. When you deploy two carrier strike groups against a country that has spent decades preparing for exactly this scenario, you're not demonstrating strength, you're revealing the limitations of your strategic toolkit. The carriers can't invade Iran, the country is too large, too mountainous, too well defended, and any ground invasion would require a mobilization that would make the Iraq war look like a minor skirmish. The carriers can launch airstrikes, certainly, but airstrikes alone have never succeeded in achieving regime change or forcing fundamental policy shifts. We've seen this movie before in Serbia, in Iraq, in Libya, in Syria. Air power is devastating, but it's not decisive in the way that would be necessary to achieve Washington's objectives. So what was the real purpose of deploying that second carrier? I would argue it's largely theater, a performance designed for domestic and international audiences to create the impression of resolve and capability. For domestic consumption, it allows politicians to claim they're taking strong action against Iran, supporting allies, standing up to adversaries. For international audiences, it's meant to reassure partners and intimidate rivals, but increasingly both audiences are seeing through the performance. The thing about military power is that it's only useful if others believe you're willing to use it and that it will be effective when you do. If potential adversaries calculate that using it would be too costly, too risky, or ultimately ineffective, then the power itself becomes an expensive showpiece rather than a usable instrument of policy. This is the dilemma Washington now faces. The carrier strike groups cost billions to build and maintain. They project an image of power, but actually employing them against a well-prepared adversary could expose vulnerabilities that would shatter the entire illusion of American military supremacy. Iran called this bluff, and the implications extend far beyond the Middle East. Every country watching this standoff is taking notes. They're observing that Iran can withstand American pressure, can maintain its regional influence despite sanctions and military threats, can even strengthen its position while American carriers sit offshore, accomplishing nothing of strategic significance. This observation has consequences for how other countries think about their own relationships with Washington, about the value of American security guarantees, about the risks of defying American demands. We're living through a transition period in global affairs, one of those rare historical moments when the old order is breaking down, but the new order hasn't fully crystallized. These transitions are always dangerous because the declining power, in this case the United States, faces a choice between accepting reduced influence gracefully or attempting to maintain its position through increasingly aggressive and risky actions. History suggests that declining powers rarely choose the graceful option. They tend to double down, to take bigger risks, to pursue military adventures that they hope will restore their position, but that often accelerate their decline instead. The deployment of those carriers could be seen as exactly this kind of doubling down. It's an expensive, high-profile gesture that's supposed to demonstrate resolve, but that actually highlights the gap between American aspirations and American capabilities in the current strategic environment. Iran didn't need to fire a shot to win this round. They just needed to stand firm, to coordinate with their partners, and to wait for reality to assert itself. And reality is asserting itself in ways that should deeply concern anyone who cares about global stability, because a declining hegemon that refuses to accept its reduced circumstances is one of the most dangerous forces in international politics.